The last thing my mother said to me before she slid the envelope across the dining room table was, "We should have done this years ago." She didn't whisper it. She didn't look away when she said it. She looked right at me with that particular expression she'd worn my entire life, lips pressed together, chin slightly lifted, as though everything I'd ever said or done had been a minor inconvenience she'd been quietly tolerating since the day I was born. And my father sat beside her, his hands folded on the table the way they always were when he'd already made up his mind about something and was waiting for the world to catch up. It was my 32nd birthday. They had decorated the dining room. That part still gets me when I think about it, even now. There were balloons, silver and white, and a banner that said, "Happy Birthday, Cassidy," in that loopy font my mother had always bought from the same party store in Glendale. There was a cake from the Good Bakery, the one on Forsyth Avenue, with the cream cheese frosting I'd loved since I was 6 years old. The table was set with the good dishes, my grandmother's china, the set with the tiny blue flowers around the rim that my mother only brought out for Thanksgiving and Easter. She had set the table with grandmother's china and then slid me disownment papers. That was the moment I understood fully and completely that I had never really known my mother at all. I need to back up, because if I start at the dinner, you won't understand what the envelope actually contained or why it mattered as much as it did, or why, when the moment finally came, I was ready for it in ways they could never have anticipated. My name is Cassidy Marlowe. I grew up in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, in a neighborhood where the lawns were always exactly the right color of green, and the HOA sent letters if your trash cans stayed visible past Tuesday afternoon. My father, Gerald Marlowe, was a commercial real estate attorney. My mother, Diane, had a degree in interior design that she'd used briefly in her 20s and then set aside when she married my father and decided that managing their household and social calendar was a more appropriate use of her abilities. She was good at it, I'll say that. The house was always beautiful. The parties she threw were always talked about afterward. She had a gift for the appearance of things, the right centerpiece, the right color palette, the right smile at the right moment. The problem was that she applied the same philosophy to her children. I have one sibling, my brother Preston, who was 3 years older than me and who from the time he was approximately 12 years old could do absolutely nothing wrong in my mother's eyes. Preston was tall and athletic and handsome in that uncomplicated way that makes people assume you're also good. He smiled easily. He told the kinds of jokes that made adults laugh at family dinners. He played lacrosse in high school and got into Arizona State on an athletic scholarship and then went to work for my father's firm as a paralegal while he figured out whether he actually wanted to go to law school. He'd been figuring that out for 9 years now, still working at the firm, still living in an apartment my parents paid for, still showing up to every family dinner with a 6-pack of craft beer and a story about his fantasy football league that my father listened to with the kind of focused attention he'd never once given anything I said. I'm not bitter about Preston. I want to be clear about that. Preston is not a villain in this story. He's just someone who benefited enormously from being born first, being born male, and having the particular personality type that made our parents feel good about themselves. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. I believe that genuinely. What he didn't know, what I didn't know for most of my life, was what our grandmother actually did before she died. My grandmother, Eleanor Marlowe, was my father's mother. She died when I was 24, during my last year of graduate school at the University of Denver, where I was finishing a master's degree in forensic accounting. She had a stroke on a Wednesday morning in February and was gone by Friday evening. And I drove 14 hours straight through New Mexico and into Phoenix because I couldn't afford a last-minute flight, and I needed to get there. I adored Eleanor. She wasn't a warm woman in the conventional sense. She didn't hug easily or say, "I love you," the way some grandmothers do, like punctuation at the end of every sentence. But she was honest, and she was funny, and she had opinions on things that she stated plainly without caring whether you agreed with her. She had run a small accounting firm in Phoenix for 30 years after her husband died young, and she'd done it entirely by herself. And she had a way of looking at a financial document that reminded me, even as a child, of the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. Like she could see things other people couldn't. When I told her I wanted to study accounting, she was the only person in my family who didn't look confused. She said, "Of course you do. You've always seen the numbers and everything." I didn't exactly know what she meant when I was 17. I understood it later. At her funeral, my mother cried in a way that seemed, even then, slightly too visible. She'd never been close to Eleanor. Eleanor had never pretended to think Diane was the right match for her son, and Diane had never pretended to find Eleanor anything but difficult. But at the funeral, Diane wept with the particular grief of someone performing for an audience. And afterward, at the reception at my parents' house, she moved through the rooms accepting condolences with an expression of dignified sorrow that I recognized from years of watching her manage social situations. My father was genuinely destroyed. Whatever his faults, and they are considerable, which I'll get to, he had loved his mother. He sat in the armchair in the corner of the living room and didn't say much to anyone, and at one point I sat beside him and took his hand, and he squeezed it once, hard, and then let go. It was one of the realest moments we'd ever had. 3 weeks after the funeral, my parents' attorney called to inform the family that Eleanor's estate was being processed and that there would be a reading of the will at his office the following Thursday. I was back in Denver by then. My father called to tell me I didn't need to come down. "It's straightforward," he said. "Your grandmother kept things simple. There's the house, a few accounts, some personal property. It'll all be sorted out here." I said, "Okay." I was in the middle of thesis work. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. I didn't think about Eleanor's estate for almost 8 years. I graduated, got my CPA license, and took a job at a mid-size forensic accounting firm in Denver called Hartwell & Associates. I was good at the work. Not just good, I was the kind of employee that partners notice quietly and then fight over during performance review season. I worked methodically, I wrote clear reports, and I had a particular talent for finding the thing in a financial record that wasn't supposed to be there. My personal life was quieter. I dated a man named Daniel for 4 years, and we ended things mutually and without drama when we both admitted we were better friends than partners. I had an apartment near City Park with hardwood floors and a small balcony where I grew tomatoes in containers every summer. I had 2 close friends from graduate school, a book club I'd joined somewhat ironically and then grown to genuinely love, and a cat named Archie, who knocked things off shelves with what I could only describe as intentionality. I went home to Phoenix for Christmas and Thanksgiving and felt each time the particular exhaustion of spending 4 days in a house where I was either invisible or vaguely disappointing. My mother had a way of asking about my life that made it sound like she was reading from a list of things she felt obligated to cover. How's the job? Still in Denver? Any news on the relationship front? She asked about Preston's life with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know the answers. She asked about mine the way you ask about the weather in a city you'll never visit. My father was warmer in his distant way. He'd occasionally ask about a case I was working on if I mentioned it first, and his questions were usually intelligent, but the conversations never went anywhere. They'd get 5 exchanges in and then drift back to Preston's latest project at the firm, or the neighbor's new construction, or whatever home renovation my mother was currently planning. I told myself it was fine, that lots of people had families like this, that it wasn't cruelty, just indifference, and indifference was something you could live with. I was wrong about that last part. The year I turned 31, 2 things happened that changed everything. The first was a case that came across my desk in October. It was a relatively standard fraud investigation, a family business dispute in which one sibling alleged that another had been systematically draining their deceased father's estate before and after his death. The attorney who hired us wanted documentation of the financial irregularities. I spent 6 weeks pulling apart 8 years of records, and what I found was elegant in a horrible way. The kind of fraud that only works because it relies on the victim trusting the person doing it. The second was a phone call from a woman named Margaret Osei. Margaret was Eleanor's former bookkeeper. She'd worked for Eleanor's accounting firm for 12 years before Eleanor retired and closed the practice. I had met her exactly once at Eleanor's retirement party when I was 15, and I had no idea why she was calling me. She said she'd gotten my number from a mutual contact. She said she'd been thinking about reaching out for years. She said there was something I needed to know about your grandmother's estate. I remember I was standing at my kitchen counter when she said that. I remember the light was already going outside, the kind of thin gray light that Denver gets in late October, and Archie was sitting on the windowsill watching the street below with absolute concentration. "What kind?" I asked. "The kind," Margaret said carefully, "that I think you'd want a lawyer for before you do anything about it." Eleanor had changed her will 14 months before she died. I didn't know this. My parents didn't tell me. The attorney who handled the estate, a man named Clifford Baines, who had been my father's golf partner for 20 years, had processed everything quietly and without anyone asking too many questions. What Margaret told me was this. Eleanor had come to her in the last year of her life worried. She had recently updated her estate plan with a new attorney, not Clifford Baines, but a woman named Patricia Lund who practiced in Scottsdale and had made significant changes. She had left her house to be sold and the proceeds split between her 2 grandchildren equally. She had left her investment accounts, approximately $340,000, in trust for me specifically, tied to my continued work in accounting or finance. She had left personal property to be divided as specified in a separate document. None of this, as far as Margaret knew, had ever happened. She showed me the documents, Margaret told me. I witnessed her sign them. There was another witness, too, a woman named Carol from Patricia Lund's office. It was all proper. Eleanor was completely clear-minded. She wanted you to know what she was doing and why, but she died before she could tell you. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" I asked. There was a pause. "Because your father is a lawyer," Margaret said, "and I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm 71 and I've had a health scare of my own, and I decided I'd rather know I'd done the right thing." I thanked her. I hung up the phone. I sat down on the floor next to Archie's windowsill, and I didn't move for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and started working. I want to explain something about forensic accounting because it matters here. Most people think fraud is discovered through dramatic moments, a whistleblower, a deathbed confession, a document slipped under a door. Sometimes that's true, but most of the time, fraud is discovered through patience, through the slow, methodical process of building a record that cannot be argued with, through documentation that makes the truth not just visible, but irrefutable. I was very good at this. I did not call my parents. I did not confront anyone. I hired a private attorney in Denver, a woman named Serena Park, who came recommended by a colleague and who specialized in estate litigation, and I told her everything Margaret had told me, and then I went to work. It took me 4 months. I located Patricia Lund in Scottsdale. She was still practicing. When I called her office and explained who I was, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she said, "I've been wondering when someone would call." She pulled Eleanor's file. The documents were there. The updated will, signed and properly witnessed, dated 14 months before Eleanor's death. Patricia had filed the appropriate paperwork in Maricopa County Probate Court at the time of Eleanor's death. What she didn't know was whether Clifford Baines had ever disclosed the existence of this updated will to the court, because the probate process had moved through a different department and she hadn't been informed of the outcome. Serena requested the probate records. The updated will had never been submitted. Clifford Baines had submitted an earlier version, one that left everything to my father outright, with no specific provisions for grandchildren at all. The estate had been probated based on this earlier document. My father had inherited everything. The house was sold 18 months after Eleanor's death, quietly, and the proceeds gone into my parents' accounts. $340,000 in investment accounts, a house that sold for $410,000, personal property distributed however my parents saw fit. All of it. And I had received a pearl necklace that belonged to Eleanor and a card from my mother saying she was sorry she hadn't been able to save more of Eleanor's things for me. I need to tell you about the months between discovering this and my 32nd birthday, because that time is not empty. That time is where I built everything. Serena filed a petition to reopen Eleanor's probate estate in January. The grounds were suppression of a later dated will, a serious allegation that, if proven, could mean criminal fraud charges for Clifford Baines and potentially my father, depending on what level of involvement could be demonstrated to be. My father didn't know we'd filed. The petition was served to Clifford Baines and to my father as the administrator of the estate, and I was told the paperwork would reach him within 2 weeks of filing. Those 2 weeks were when I got the call about my birthday dinner. My mother called on a Thursday afternoon, cheerful in the particular bright way she got when she decided something was going to be pleasant and was communicating this to you in advance so you'd cooperate. "We want to do something special for 32, she said. "Just family, the good china. I'm ordering from Forsyth Bakery." I said yes. I booked a flight. I did not tell Sareva I was going. She would have advised against it probably, but I needed to be there. I needed to understand something about my parents that I could only understand by being in the room with them. I thought going into it that the dinner might be uncomfortable but ultimately survivable. I thought they might have received the petition papers by then and be planning to address it, to explain, to offer something. I thought perhaps my father had some version of a reason that I hadn't considered. I was not prepared for the envelope. The dinner started the way those dinners always started. My mother in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter with efficient grace, the television in the living room tuned to something my father wasn't really watching. Preston arrived 20 minutes after me with his six-pack and a birthday card and a hug that was genuinely warm because Preston, whatever his blind spots, has always been decent to me personally. We ate. My mother had made the lemon chicken I'd grown up on, the one with the capers, and it was as good as it always was. Preston talked about a football game, my father asked me one question about my job, and then the conversation moved on. Normal. Familiar. I watched my father's face all through dinner, looking for something, some awareness, some flicker of what was coming. But Gerald Marlowe had spent 40 years in a profession that rewarded composure, and his face gave me nothing. It was after the cake, after we'd sung, after I'd blown out the candles, after my mother had cut the slices with the precision she applied to everything, that she reached beneath her chair and produced the envelope. It was a standard manila envelope, legal size. My name was typed on the front, not handwritten, typed and centered the way my father's firm typed everything. "We've been doing some thinking," my mother said, "your father and I, and we've decided that it's time to formalize some things." Preston looked up from his plate. My father still didn't look at me. My mother slid the envelope across the grandmother's china and said, "We should have done this years ago." I opened it. Inside was a document, several pages, legal formatting, prepared by my father's firm. It was, as best I can describe it, a formal declaration of estrangement. It stated that Gerald and Diane Marlowe were severing all legal and personal ties with their daughter, Cassidy Ann Marlowe. It cited, in vague but pointed language, my persistent attitude of ingratitude, my failure to maintain appropriate family relations, and my recent actions that have demonstrated a fundamental betrayal of family trust. That last phrase, recent actions that have demonstrated a fundamental betrayal of family trust. So, They had received the petition papers, and their response was to disown me at my birthday dinner, at the table set with grandmother's china, with Preston sitting 3 feet away holding his fork and looking like he'd just witnessed a car accident. I read the entire document, every page. My mother watched me with that lifted chin and pressed lips. My father finally looked at me, and his expression was not the composure I'd expected. It was something rawer than that, something that might have been shame dressed up as anger. When I finished reading, I set the document down next to my cake plate. "Cassidy," Preston said, "what is—" "Give us a minute, Preston," my mother said. "What is that document?" And his voice had shifted into something I'd rarely heard from him. "Preston!" Her voice was sharper now. He looked at me. "Cass, what's going on?" I had prepared for a lot of scenarios. I had prepared for crying, and I had prepared for the anger, and I had prepared for the cold, controlled dignity I decided I would maintain regardless of what happened. What I hadn't prepared for was my brother's face at that moment. The particular expression of someone who is realizing for the first time that a world he thought he understood is not what he believed it to be. I reached into my bag. "Since we're doing paperwork," I said, "I brought some too." I want to be honest about what I'd brought. I had not brought the entire legal file. Serena had the legal file. What I had brought was a summary document she had prepared at my request. 12 pages, clearly organized, factual, and precise. It contained the following: a copy of Eleanor's updated will, signed and witnessed, dated 14 months before her death. A copy of the probate filing submitted by Clifford Baines, showing the earlier will had been submitted instead. A comparison of the two documents, highlighting the specific provisions that had been excluded. A timeline of events following Eleanor's death, the probate proceedings, the sale of the house, the disposition of the investment accounts, and a single letter written in Eleanor's handwriting that Margaret had kept. A letter Eleanor had written to Margaret explaining what she was doing and why, in case anything ever needed to be verified. I had read that letter so many times I could recite it from memory. In it, Eleanor wrote that she had always seen me clearly, and that she was proud of who I had become, and that she wanted to make sure I had a foundation that no one could take away from me. No one could take away from me. I placed the summary document on the table, in front of my father. "I thought you might want to see this before our attorneys speak again," I said. "Serena Park, my attorney, has already filed the petition to reopen the estate, but I wanted you to understand what the evidence looks like. All of it." My mother started to say something. My father put his hand on her arm. He put the document down. He had gone very still in the way that, when I was a child, had always meant a storm was coming. But no storm came. He just sat there, and for the first time in my memory, Gerald Marlowe looked old. "It was more complicated than—" he started. "Did you know, Dad," Preston said again, quietly, "that Grandma Eleanor changed her will, that Cassie was supposed to get money that she never got?" My father didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. Here is what I learned over the following weeks, as everything unraveled. My father had known, not immediately. Clifford Baines had called him the week after Eleanor's death, before the probate was filed, to inform him that a later will had surfaced with a different attorney. My father had reviewed the document. He had made a decision. Whether he told Clifford to suppress it or whether Clifford made that choice independently and my father simply didn't correct it, that would be for the attorneys to sort out. But he had known. He had known for 8 years that Eleanor had intended to leave me money. He had known, and every Christmas I'd come home to that house, every birthday call he'd made from a distance, every conversation about my career that he'd let trail off, he had known. My mother, as far as I could determine, had known very little. She hadn't been involved in the estate. She'd benefited from the money without knowing its specific source. That didn't make her innocent. You don't slide disownment papers across the table to your daughter who has done nothing wrong and walk away clean, but her knowledge was different from his. Preston hired his own attorney within the week. He told me before he did it, called me from his car outside our parents' house where he'd gone to get some things he'd left there. "I want you to know I'm not doing this to make things harder," he said, "but I was named in that will too. I need to understand what happened." "I know," I said. "I didn't know, Cass." "I know that too." There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," he said. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." "It actually helps," I told him, and I meant it. The legal proceedings took 11 months. I'm not going to walk you through every filing and every deposition and every motion because that would be its own story and not the one that matters here. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Clifford Baines, when faced with the documented evidence, admitted to suppressing the will. He claimed my father had directed him to. My father's attorneys contested this. There were depositions, there were financial records subpoenaed, there were long, expensive days in conference rooms in downtown Phoenix with multiple attorneys and mediator. In the end, Clifford Baines surrendered his law license as part of a settlement agreement that avoided criminal prosecution. My father's firm quietly parted ways with him around the same time. My father did not go to prison. The evidence of his direct direction of Baines was contested enough that criminal charges were uncertain, and Serena, who is not a criminal attorney, but who consulted with several, advised me that a civil resolution was more certain and more appropriate to pursue. What I wanted was not to destroy my father. What I wanted was what Eleanor had intended me to have. The estate was reopened. The house proceeds, which had been sitting largely untouched in an investment account my parents maintained, were recoverable. The $340,000 in Eleanor's investment accounts had been partially spent, but enough remained, combined with interest calculations and negotiated settlement figures, that I ultimately received a payment of approximately $480,000, which reflected not just the original amount, but damages for the delay and the legal costs I'd incurred. Preston received his share of the house proceeds as well. He put most of it in savings and used some to finally, at the age of 35, apply to law school. He got in. I want to tell you about one specific afternoon about 9 months after the birthday dinner when I drove to Phoenix not for a hearing, but for a different reason entirely. I went to the house I'd grown up in. My parents still lived there. The settlement hadn't required them to sell it. And I sat outside in my rental car for a few minutes, looking at the lawn that was still exactly the right shade of green. I didn't go inside. I hadn't spoken to my mother since the birthday dinner. My father and I had communicated only through attorneys. The formal estrangement document they'd given me had, in a way I don't think they'd anticipated, simply accelerated my willingness to proceed with the legal action rather than hoping for a private resolution. What I had come to do was visit Eleanor's grave. She was buried at a cemetery in North Phoenix, a quiet place with old trees and irregular paths that didn't feel like the manicured lawns I'd grown up near. I brought white peonies because those had been her flowers. She'd grown them in her backyard for 20 years and complained each year that the Phoenix heat was wrong for them, and grew them anyway. I sat beside her grave for a long time. I'm not a person who talks to grave markers generally, but I thanked her for seeing me, for trying to make sure I was protected, for writing that letter to Margaret, which had survived 8 years in a filing cabinet and then traveled its way back to me exactly when I needed it. I told her about the settlement, about the work it had taken, about the fact that I had found in the middle of all of it that the forensic accounting skills she'd encouraged me towards had been the exact right tools for this exact situation, like she'd known. I sat there until the lights started to go golden through the trees. Then I drove to the airport and flew back to Denver. There are things I haven't told you yet because they belong here at the end rather than anywhere earlier. The first is about my mother. Diane Marlowe called me in March, about 4 months after the proceedings concluded. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 2 days later. I let that go too. She sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised me because my mother had not handwritten anything I could recall since I was a child, and she signed my birthday cards. The letter was long. It went through several stages that I recognized: explanation, then justification, then something that crept close to what might have been genuine remorse without quite landing there. She wrote, "I hadn't known about the will." I believe this. She wrote that she'd been wrong to stay silent when she learned about the legal proceedings, that she should have pushed my father to resolve it differently. She wrote that presenting me with the estrangement document had been an error of judgment, which is a phrase that tells you she was still thinking like my mother, packaging things in language that minimized. But then she wrote, "I have spent the last months trying to understand how I made you feel like a stranger in your own family, and I don't have an answer yet, but I know it happened, and I know it was wrong." That sentence was not like her. That sentence had the quality of something someone works up to over a long time. I wrote back. Not warmly, not coldly, honestly. I told her I wasn't ready for a relationship, that what had happened wasn't only about the money. The money was almost the simpler part. That what I needed was time and distance, and the possibility, not the guarantee, that things could be different. That I would not be coming home for the holidays this year, and that I didn't know when I would be. I sent the letter, and then I made dinner, and I watched television, and Archie sat on my chest and purred with his eyes closed, and I felt something that wasn't happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular feeling of having said a true thing clearly. The second thing I haven't told you is about myself. When the settlement came through, I sat with the money for a while before deciding what to do with it. Some people would invest it all immediately. Some would spend some portion of it on something meaningful. I did both eventually, but the first thing I did was nothing. I let it sit in a holding account while I thought. What I kept coming back to was Eleanor's letter. "I want to make sure you have a foundation that no one can take away from you." She had meant financial foundation, partly, but when I sat with it, I thought the word foundation was doing more work than that. A foundation isn't just money. It's the sense that you stand on solid ground, that you know who you are and what you're capable of, that when someone tries to diminish you or erase you, you have the resources, internal and external, to remain standing. My parents had tried, in different ways for different reasons, to make me feel like I was less than I was. My mother by being perpetually uninterested, my father by choosing money over his own daughter's rightful inheritance, and then watching me show up at holidays and not correcting it. What I'd discovered in the 11 months of building the case was that I had never been less. I had been the person in that family who paid attention, who kept records, who understood how systems worked, who was patient enough to wait for the right moment. I had been, without knowing it, exactly what Eleanor had seen when she looked at me. That was worth more than the settlement, though the settlement was also very nice. In the spring, about 1.5 years after the birthday dinner, 8 months after the settlement, I had dinner with Preston and his girlfriend, a woman named Tanya, who teaches high school chemistry and has opinions about everything and shares them freely, which I find deeply refreshing. We went to a Thai place near his apartment in Tempe. He'd gotten his law school acceptance by then. He was deferring enrollment for a year to finish some things at the firm and to, as he put it, figure out what he was actually there to do. "You should have told me sooner," he said, not for the first time. "When you first found out, you should have called me." "I didn't know how much you knew," I said. "He didn't know anything." "I know, but I couldn't be sure." He nodded slowly. We'd had some version of this conversation before. I think he needed to have it more than once to finish processing it. "What are you going to do? With everything? The money? All of it?" I bought a house, I told him, in Denver. Actual house, not an apartment, with a yard. For Archie? Largely. Tanya laughed. Preston smiled, the real one, not the social one. And I'm starting something, I said, with Serena's help, a consulting practice, focused on estate fraud. Preston looked at me for a moment. Grandma Eleanor, he said. Grandma Eleanor. I agreed. What I had realized across all those months of working through the records and the timelines and the documents was that Eleanor's case was not unusual, that the suppression of updated wills, the manipulation of probate proceedings, the quiet redirection of elderly people's carefully made plans, these things happened with a frequency that the legal system was not equipped to catch on its own. They happened because the victims were usually dead by the time anyone might notice. They happened because family members trusted each other. They happened because the people best positioned to catch them didn't know where to look. I knew where to look. I want to tell you how it feels now. Not the triumph part, that fades faster than you'd think, but the everyday feeling of having come through something. It feels quieter than I expected. My apartment became a house, and there's a yard where I've put in a proper garden, not containers on a balcony, but actual ground, and I've learned more about soil than I ever expected to know. Archie is 11 now and sleeps more and knocks fewer things off shelves, though his commitment to intentionality when he does knock something off remains undiminished. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about my parents. This sounds like something people say and don't mean, but I find it's actually true. My father and I are in no contact. My mother and I have exchanged a handful of letters. We exist in a kind of careful correspondence that is neither relationship nor estrangement, just acknowledgement that we are both still here and that what happens next is undetermined. I think about Eleanor. I think about her growing peonies in Phoenix heat and complaining about it. I think about the way she looked at financial documents. I think about her sitting in Patricia Lund's office on an ordinary Tuesday, making sure that the granddaughter who understood numbers would have something no one could erase. She had known something I didn't know yet, that the people who try to erase you often underestimate the very things that make you impossible to erase. She had left me more than money. She had left me a problem that required exactly my skills to solve. She had left me a reason to believe that the years I'd spent becoming good at seeing the truth in numbers were not incidental, but essential. She had seen me the way a grandmother should see a grandchild, not as an ornament or an extension of herself, but as a person who was already fully becoming who she was meant to be. I drive past that house sometimes in Phoenix when I'm there for work. The lawn is still the right shade of green. The trash cans are never visible past Tuesday afternoon. I don't stop. I don't need to. Eleanor left me a foundation. I built the rest myself.